Welcome. My name is Laura Pena, and this is the Poetry Society of Texas podcast. In this show, we discuss an award-winning book of poetry with its author. Our guest today is the 2004 winner of the Edwin M. Aiken Memorial Award, JPaulHolcomb. JPaulHolcomb is known as the poet from Double Oak, and he became intrigued with poetry while an undergraduate at McMurray College, which is now the university in Abilene, Texas. He's got his master's degree in computer science from Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And he's been published in Slow Dancer, Harp Streams Poetry Journal, New Texas, Wintover, and many others. We will discuss J. Paul's book, Looking for Love in the Telecom Quarter. Welcome, J. Paul.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm so looking forward to this interview. So I just want to start. Where did you get your inspiration for the poems in this book?
Well, they came from different sources. This book was not written for the competition. It was assembled for the competition. So the poems had been around for a while in my inventory, and I was happy to be able to find ones that met my theme. Only a few were new poems.
Okay. Is there a theme to the book?
Well, it really follows a fellow by the name of Hal. From his beginnings, his growing up, through college, and then off to the world. I call the first part of the book where he's growing up and finishing college, I call that Growing Up Thirsty, because he's in West Texas.
Yes, it can get pretty dry out there. Yeah. Yes, I noticed as I was reading through your book that it did seem to have this current character of Hal. Is Hal a made-up character, or did you draw inspiration from someone in real life about it?
Well, to tell you the truth, I was first picking out poems of my own, and mostly they were my life, and then I realized I was picking poems that weren't my life. And so I created Hal. They could all be Hal's life.
Yes. Now, is there a mix of fixed format poems and free verse in this collection?
Oh, yes. I've got blank verse, free verse, sonnets, stretch sonnets, minute, prose poems, ballads, and then a friend of mine, I've got one of her forms in here.
I see.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that I did notice some of the poems in here are very prose-like and narrative, and then there's others that follow a more structured form, like you were saying, a blank verse or a sonnet form. Can you tell me a little bit about those?
Sure. I've got a couple of Shakespearean sonnets. Now, I have a friend in Fort Worth who created this thing called the stretch sonnet. Her theory was that sonnets did not contest as well as free verse. So what she did was introduce new line breaks, and she might not change the poem at all, but she'd end up with a poem that's about 20, 25 lines long instead of 14, which is the sonnet. And I've got a few of those in here.
Okay, well, we'd like to hear some of those. So can you tell us about the poem that you're going to be reading for us today?
I'm going to be reading a poem. It's a blank verse poem called Jump Back. It's set in the Blue Ridge Parkway, where my daughter was working one summer, and we went up to visit her, and there are several walking trails, and this poem takes a couple of the walking trails. It's written as a response to Robert Frost's directive. Jump back in response to Robert Frost's directive. You start at Rocky Knob, then wander off the ridge to Castle Rock, past Hickory and Beach, down to a path still little worn. You meet a Wytheville man who says he hikes this way each week to find chimney remains. There must be 9 between the creek and ridge, he says, and you can only nod and grin. You wonder if the path was ever worn, and where the children played, and if indeed there once were children here. But then who else could play at Castle Rock and walk the log that straddles falls so toes can dangle down and feel the frigid water scuttling past? You find a pole, a walking stick, and prop yourself, imagining support that may have vaulted youth up over Castle Rock to pools made deep by falling mountain streams. You try it too. You run and plant the pole and start your vault, but foolish dreamers' jump can snap unseasoned wood. One may admire afar the smooth and friendly Castle Rock, but if one tries to jump, as if the years will vanish in the vaulter's valiant lunge, then crags can tear and bruise where dreamers fall.
That was very lovely. I like the way that you read that, and it really sparks a particular place. I love those images in there. Did you start out writing this in a structured form, or did you just let it go wherever your mind drifted to?
Well, since I was responding to Robert Frost, I felt it should be in the blank verse form.
Mm-hmm.
A blank verse, you know, people will think it's free verse, but it's not. It has 5 I ams per line, and an I am is unstressed, stressed. So you start at rocky knob. You can hear the I ams in there, and so the whole thing is iambic pentameter.
Yes, you can hear the musicality from it. Would you like to read us another poem?
Oh, sure. Let me read you one of those stretch sonnets.
Yes, please.
Okay. Now this one is, I made Hal, the son of a farmer, and his uncle was also a farmer. And so that's where Hal went quite a distance from me because I've never farmed. Okay, and but this one is a stretch sonnet. While you can't see the rhyme on the page, you can hear it. Okay, okra in a special place, Hal remembers. On Father's farm, he had his tiny plot where sweet potatoes, corn, and okra grew. It was secluded, a forgotten spot, this little land for vegetable stew. Now cotton was my daddy's money crop, and he made cash enough to raise us well. But on that special ground where he'd weed chop, nearby the windmill there, beside the swell, that was the place where he would often go to look for inner peace. With hands in dirt, he would lift soil to sky, then drop it slow, the sweat stains showing on his khaki shirt. He planted seed with such pacific flair, sweet magic seemed to permeate the air.
Oh, that's wonderful. Tell me, why is poetry important to everyone today?
Well, I think poetry is important because, well, for one thing, poetry is a concise way of putting your thoughts or words or love out there. You can be effective doing it in prose, but most of the time going to take longer. And poetry can be very special. You know, we've all got poems that we carry around, or lines from poems that we carry around all our lives. So poetry is just part of life. It's an important part.
Yes, I would agree with you there. And what's your advice to new poets about finding poem ideas or in their writing practice or process?
Well, many poets will advise you to write daily. A friend of mine had a journal, and she was very faithful with the journal. And as she realized she wasn't practicing her poetry enough, she started writing her journal as a series of cinquains, which is a 5-line verse form. And when she died, those journals were very special.
Yes, I imagine so. Now tell me, how important is it for poets to participate in a poetry community like the Poetry Society of Texas?
Well, I think it's important because, you know, when you are around other poets, You can get ideas. You can share ways of writing your poetry. Quite often, I'm in, one of the groups I'm in now is the Denton Poets Assembly. That group meets once a month. Then 4 of us critique poems weekly with one another.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can get ideas. Each one of us, is kind of funny that as you're critiquing poems, there are certain things that I may tend to do that one person will pick up, and then another person will pick up other things. And by sharing like that, you tighten your poem and make it stronger. And I think it's very important.
I would agree with you there. I think that you can always get something from hearing others and reading others' poetry and getting fresh eyes on your own work. I believe that's very, very valuable. In reading the poems from your book, I have to say that one of my favorites was Fuchsia.
Oh.
I read that, and I just really was struck by all the color in it, but also just that emotional vulnerability in that poem, that you were not afraid to really go there. Do you think, it's important too sometimes, poets have to put themselves out there?
Oh, yes. If you're not willing to be vulnerable, you're not going to have many readers.
Exactly. Can you tell us a little bit about Fuchsia?
Sure. It's a made-up situation. I was thinking about the song, A White Sport Coat and a Pink Carnation, and I started thinking about that, and next thing I know, I'm writing about that, and I'm creating this situation, and that goes along with it, and I read that poem quite often to groups.
Yes. Will you read it for us, and this will close out our program?
Okay, I certainly will. This is a poem, but it's a prose poem. It goes from margin to margin across the page. Fuchsia. I suppose I can blame it on the song where the guy sings about placing a pink carnation on his white sport coat just to get stood up by the only girl he ever loved. But when I was a senior in high school, I couldn't find a pink carnation anywhere in town. No florist carried pink, only fuchsia. But I fancied the shade. Fuchsia is like pink on steroids. And I got me a fuchsia carnation to go with her corsage of baby pink roses to wear to the prom. I wanted the night to be special. I had heard what happens on prom night, and I wanted everything to be just right. But we had been at the prom for only an hour when she saw a guy wearing a pink carnation, a guy with a brown-eyed, handsome man look. I accused her of being taken in by the dimple that showed when he smiled. She said, "Don't be silly," that she liked the match, pink against baby pink. Then she left me alone at the prom with my fuchsia carnation. I matured that night, but not in the way I had planned. I had to wait to grow from boy to man. To this day, that prom night remains fixed in my memory, even if I did not press that fuchsia carnation into my scrapbook, even though I cried little boy tears as I drove home from the dance, and even though I tore the special photograph made of her and me at the prom into 1,000 tiny pieces and threw them like celebration confetti from the window of my second-floor math class into a wind that was carrying the grit of West Texas all the way from El Paso to Fort Worth.
That was wonderful. JPaul, it has been such a pleasure talking with you this evening. Thank you so much for sharing your poetry with us.
Well, thank you, Laura. I've enjoyed it.
Yes. This has been a Poetry Society of Texas podcast featuring JPaulHolcomb. This show is sponsored by the Poetry Society of Texas, whose website is poetrysocietyoftexas.org. The podcast producer is Terry Jude Miller. Music is provided by Ed and Mim Frita. Technical and editing services provided by JDarrell Kirkley. I am your host, Laura Pena.